It's Wednesday, it's the 30th of July. You're watching ARIRANG Korea's only global network. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Geon-young. It's election day here in Korea, and although the polls today are about replacing lawmakers who no longer have seats in parliament, the heat this time around beats any other election that may be bigger in size. Today's outcome will have a significant impact on Korea's political landscape for years to come. We have team coverage today. First, here's our Ji Myung-kil.
When the final results of today's by-election are in, they could very well show a split down party lines. According to analysis conducted by the rival parties, each side is expected to win in 3 to 4 constituencies, while it's anybody's guess who will take the remaining electoral districts. The ruling party and main opposition party have taken different approaches to appeal to voters. The Conservative Party has been touting its connection to President Park Geun-hye, with candidates pledging economic stimulus packages for their districts. The main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy has taken aim at the incumbent government, asking voters to hold the ruling party responsible for its perceived poor handling of April's ferry disaster and the ensuing investigation. To win in the most politically important regions, both parties have brought out their big guns. Former opposition leader Ho Nak-gyu is not only hoping to win a seat in the city of Suwon, he's hoping to solidify his position within the opposition bloc. The ruling party's Lee Jung-hyun, a former presidential secretary and key ally of President Park Geun-hye, has taken on the challenge of competing in Jeollanam-do province, a traditional liberal stronghold. A win from Lee would represent a heavy blow to the opposition bloc. Ji Myung-kil, ARIRANG News.
Now, there's just one district here in the capital city that is voting in today's by-election, and it's considered one of the most significant races. Our UDN went out to Seoul's Dongjak-B district to hear from the voters there.
This district, Dongjak-B in Seoul, is one of the most hotly contested seats in this by-election and has in the past been a major swing region. When looking at the recent local elections, candidates from the ruling Saenuri Party and main opposition party split Dongjak-B, having each won 2 seats. In this district, ruling Saenuri Party candidate Na Kyung-won, who is aiming to become a third-time lawmaker, is taking on minor opposition Justice Party candidate No Tae-chan, who is expected to absorb most of the liberal votes since the opposition camp last week joined forces to field just one candidate. The two were neck and neck in the last opinion polls released last week, showing Na of the ruling party with less than 1 percentage point lead. Now, voters here would like to see the eventual winner make progress in the investigation into April's deadly Seoul ferry disaster.
From the investigation process for Yoo Byung-hun to the Seoul ferry law, I felt frustrated that the ruling and opposition parties have been unable to come to terms. I voted for someone who could voice their opinions strongly at the National Assembly.
The winning candidate should first focus on revitalizing the local economy. The public is also hurting from the Seoul ferry tragedy. I hope our politicians do their best to relieve us of our pain.
The final turnout is forecast to be in the lower 30% range, the average turnout for by-elections. But higher than expected early voter turnout and the sweltering summer heat could keep some people at home. The National Election Commission expects the final election results to emerge at around 10 p.m. local time, at which time we'll know who the new 15 members of the National Assembly are. Yurian, ARIRANG News.
Now, we will bring you more updates from the by-elections all throughout the day, but first, here's another piece of news. The European Union and the United States earlier this morning jointly placed their strongest pressure yet in the form of far-reaching economic sanctions targeting the sectors of energy, banking, and defense on Russia. Our Song Ji-sun has the details.
The European Union and the United States on Tuesday announced further sanctions against Russia in the strongest international action yet over Moscow's support for rebels in eastern Ukraine. In Brussels, the 28-member European bloc agreed to restrictions on the trade of equipment for the oil and defense sectors. Russia's state-run banks will also be barred from raising funds in European capital markets. The move marks the strongest confrontation between Moscow and the West since the end of the Cold War. This latest action was triggered by the downing of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 by what was likely a Russian-supplied missile. Moscow continues to deny the charges. The U.S. also imposed sanctions on Moscow by banning Americans or people in the U.S. from banking with 3 Russian banks. President Obama said if Russia remains on its current path, the costs on Russia will continue to grow, and that the coordinated actions of the U.S. and EU will make the weak Russian economy even weaker. The sanctions could cost Russia some $30 billion this year, according to online media EU Observer. But if Moscow slaps back with similar action, the EU could suffer damage estimated at $55 billion. To mitigate the impact on the European economy, the new sanctions will not affect previous contracts, and Russia's natural gas, which powers European industry and lights its cities, has been spared. Russia is the world's biggest exporter of natural gas and the second biggest exporter of oil. 송지선, 아리랑 뉴스.
Now, speaking of sanctions, Washington expects fresh U.S. sanctions against North Korea will be as painful to the leadership as some very effective sanctions previously that were slapped on the communist regime back in 2005. The new set of sanctions are aimed at blocking any financial support from the outside world to Pyongyang. Our Park Ji-won takes a look.
U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce says a new bill that passed the House this week will hit the North Korean leadership hard. In an interview with South Korea's Yonhap news agency, Royce said the North Korea Sanctions Enforcement Act will be as successful as previous U.S. sanctions on North Korea in 2005, known as the BDA sanctions. The BDA sanctions are considered some of the most effective ever placed on North Korea. They not only froze a key North Korean account at the Banco Delta Asia in Macau, but the measures also forced other financial institutions to pull the plug on their dealings with Pyongyang. The sanctions were lifted later in nuclear negotiations with the North. Royce said the new bill, like the previous BDA sanctions, aims to restrict North Korea's access to international financial institutions by targeting foreign banks to facilitate the North's illicit trading like money laundering and smuggling. The bill has a secondary boycott article which can sanction third country financial institutions or companies for trading with the North in violation of UN resolutions. The U.S. lawmakers stressed, however, that the bill does not affect humanitarian aid to the North. He emphasized the goal of the bill is to block the regime's financial support system. The bill also includes seizing assets linked to North Korea's nuclear proliferation activities, human rights violations, and thorough inspection of North Korean cargo. He also said Japan's independent lifting of some sanctions against the North is counterproductive as the U.S. loses some leverage against North Korea. Royce added the international community needs to move together in terms of imposing sanctions against the North. The bill has to pass the Senate and be signed by President Obama for it to become law. Park Ji-won, ARIRANG News.
So, frosty relations between Seoul and Tokyo have brought bilateral cooperation to a near standstill at a time when North Korea continues to provoke the international community with missile launches and nuclear threats. Now, a top U.S. military commander has directed a plea at South Korea and Japan to set aside their differences and face the threats out of North Korea together. Connie Kim reports.
The top U.S. military commander in the Pacific says North Korea's nuclear capabilities have reached a serious level.
Their desire for nuclear missiles and nuclear capabilities, as we've said over and over again, are highly threatening to this global security environment.
Admiral Samuel Locklear added that South Korea and Japan should be working in step to curb the North's nuclear development, but that political tensions between the two is affecting America's ability to coordinate with its allies. Locklear said Seoul and Tokyo need to realize the importance of bilateral and trilateral military-to-military cooperation.
They have a common concern, huge common concern with North Korea. and that we encourage them to, both Japan and South Korea, to work together to overcome their political difficulties so that we can work to provide a better security environment in this region.
Historical and territorial disputes between Seoul and Tokyo have dipped bilateral relations to their lowest level in years. Those tensions have kept military cooperation at a minimum, despite repeated provocations from the north. This past weekend, Pyongyang fired off yet another missile into waters off its eastern coast, this just 10 days after the UN Security Council condemned the North for its previous series of missile launches in recent weeks. In the face of the hostilities, South Korean Defense Minister Han Min-gu said yesterday that Seoul and Washington were reviewing various ways to boost their joint combat readiness. Connie Kim, ARIRANG News.
When the latest news meets the latest business stories, we give you a bigger and better picture of the world. Business Today with Moon Gon-young. Every weekday, only on ARIRANG.
Well, we are getting more details on the government's plans to prop up the sluggish economy. Finance Minister Choi Kyung-won told policymakers Wednesday that the government will inject about $25 billion through fiscal and monetary policies in the latter half of the year. It's part of a $40 billion stimulus package announced last week. Now, Choi said that the government would soon be unveiling measures to foster the service sector in hopes of creating more jobs and increasing consumer spending. The Korean economy grew 0.6% on quarter in the April to June period, which is its weakest pace in over a year. The International Monetary Fund has once again urged South Korea to let the markets determine the foreign exchange rate. The international agency says that interference should be limited to avoid excessive volatility that could eventually hurt the economy. Well, the call from the IMF, which issued a similar statement at the start of the year, came after Seoul officials conveyed their concerns in recent weeks over the fast pace of the Korean currency's appreciation. During a one-year period up to June, the won gained more than 12% against the greenback. The Monetary Fund also expressed concern about Korea's trade surplus, which accounted for more than 6% of the country's GDP last year, against some 2%, which is seen as optimal. Now, on the industrial production front, Korea's output for industrial output production rose over 2% in June from the previous month, the biggest gain in more than 3 years. But analysts say it's largely because output was far too low in May following April's ferry disaster in this country. Na Hyun-kyung has the details.
A 2.1% monthly rise for all industries and a 2.9% jump in the mining and manufacturing sector in production for the month of June. Statistics Korea says those were the biggest gains in more than 3 years and nearly 5 years, respectively. But analysts say it's merely because of a base effect.
June numbers look good because we saw a big drop in May. The indicators for investment and spending are not strong enough for us to see this as momentum for a faster economic recovery.
The rise in the mining and manufacturing sector is attributed to increased output in semiconductors and metal processing, driven by demand from both home and abroad. But investment in plants and equipment went down by 1.4% from May, and spending also only edged up by 0.3%. Although it was the first time the overall monthly output has risen since April's ferry disaster, experts say it's too early to say that the economy is emerging out of its sluggish spending trap. They add it doesn't mean the Korean economy is not improving, but the rate that it's picking up is still pretty slow. Na Hyun-kyung, ARIRANG News.
Well, Korea has enjoyed an exceptional reputation as a global powerhouse in shipbuilding, but its leadership on the global stage is waning. The country's Chinese competitors are gaining ground quickly as their skills are quickly catching up to their very attractive prices. Our Kim Ji-yeon has an analysis.
Korean shipbuilders are struggling as their world market share fell 27% in the first 6 months of this year, a sharp drop from the 40% recorded in 2011, according to data from Seoul-based BS Financial Group. Chinese shipbuilders have filled the gap, benefiting from better price competitiveness. Korea's Hyundai Heavy Industries has been fighting back, trying to boost orders of their so-called eco-ships, or ships that come equipped with energy-efficient technology. Korea's Daewoo Shipbuilding and Marine Engineering has followed a similar course. They're producing mega-sized container ships that use 20% less fuel and emit 30% less carbon. But despite these efforts, China has led the shipbuilding sector since 2012, grabbing a 44% world market share in the first half of this year. Hyundai Heavy Industries recorded an earnings shock in the first quarter of this year with an operating loss of more than $184 million. Hyundai is expected to record operating losses of around $70 million in the second quarter. So the Korean shipbuilding industry is now eyeing new opportunities. A Daewoo Shipbuilding official told Seoul-based Yonhap News that it will put more of an emphasis on its defense-related industries, which include building submarines. Hyundai Heavy completed construction of a new company in the southeastern city of Daegu in May that will begin producing ship engines. Samsung Heavy Industries says it will focus on renewable energy, such as building wind power plants. Kim Ji-yeon, ARIRANG News.
Well, they are still number one, but Samsung's strong grip on the smartphone market is loosening considerably, and it did in the second quarter. According to market research firm IDC, the Korean tech giant's share of the global smartphone market slumped to slightly over 25% in the April to June period. Well, that's down 7.1 percentage points from a year earlier. Samsung's major rival Apple also saw its market share dip, but only by about 1 percentage point to 11.9%. Chinese manufacturers are also gaining ground very quickly. Huawei was in third place in the second quarter with a 6.9% market share, followed by Lenovo at 5.4%. Well, here in Korea, domestic demand has remained sluggish for some time. So you might be surprised to hear that overseas travel spending by Koreans actually hit a record high in June. That's according to data released by the Bank of Korea, and it shows Koreans traveling abroad spent slightly over $1.7 billion last month, breaking the previous record of $1.69 billion set in April. Well, the figure has also led to post a new quarterly record of $5 billion in the April to June period. Experts attribute this spike in overseas spending to the growing number of Koreans traveling abroad, especially for early summer holidays, coupled with the strengthening of the Korean won. Well, for many years, Korea's inflexible labor market and strained labor management relations have been cited as being major obstacles to enhancing the country's competitiveness. In fact, according to the World Economic Forum in 2013, Korea's labor market efficiency and labor management cooperation placed 78th and 132nd in the world, respectively. Well, it's against this backdrop that Korea's Tripartite Commission of Labor, Management, and Government were back up and running last year under the Park administration. And just yesterday, the leaders met again for the first time since last September. Let's take an in-depth look, and Dr. Kim Byung-ju is live on the line. Dr. Kim, so yesterday, the leaders of the government, labor, and management, they got together to get this Tripartite Commission going again. Key points to note from this meeting?
Well, first of all, most of the key players regarding the labor relations, at least on the government side, were present. Deputy Prime Minister Choi Kyung-won and Lee Ki-kwon, the Minister of Labor, as well as Yoon Sang-jik, the Minister of Industry. They were there together with the representatives of the business community and also representatives of the labor as well. This time, perhaps for the first time in about 10 months period, the representative labor, the leadership of Federation of Korea's trade unions were there to carry on a discussion with the representatives of the government as well as the business community on the issues of how to revitalize the economy through the cooperation between labor and the management. And they had a lot of different issues to discuss. And this was just the first step towards possibly the leadership of FKTU, Federation of Korean Trade Union, rejoining this tripartite commission, from which they exited towards the end of last year. And clearly, however, though, KCTU, Korea Confederation of Trade Unions, their leadership was not there. This is an organization that's a little bit more progressive. So without that part, at least half of the labor side of Korea's labor landscape were participating in this meeting. So in that sense, it attracted a lot of attention.
Now, Dr. Kim, on the Korea Confederation of Trade Unions absence there, we will go over that in a little bit. But first, like you said, some observers seem to see this as a second phase of the Deputy Prime Minister for Economy's drive to move the Korean economy forward. What are the major issues to be resolved at this commission?
The thing is, there is a long list of issues that needs to be resolved through the discussion of the representatives of the government, the management, as well as the labor. For instance, the reduction of the working hours and how that would actually lead to creation of the hourly works, not full-time, non-full-time, but hour-based works. That's a big issue there. And also, since there will be extension of the retirement age, postponing retirement age, we need to introduce here in this country so-called peak wage system. And for that, the cooperation from the labor is a critical matter, and that needs to be worked out at this commission. And also, the base wage system, where there is still an agreement, even despite the ruling by the court, whether the regular the salaries, regular bonuses will be included as a part of base wage or not. And there is a whole bunch of more other issues that needs to be worked out at this commission for sure.
Now, let's talk about KCTU, as we promised. Among the two national labor umbrella organizations, of course, the Korea Confederation of Trade Union is not, like you said, participating in this tripartite commission. What is the KCTU's rationale for the rejection?
Well, to get to that point, first of all, let's make it clear that even FKTU, whose representatives were present in yesterday's meeting, they have not made their final decision to whether they will participate in tripartite commission or not. They said, depending on the operation of this special subcommittee within commission, they will discuss the issues of public sector reform. They will decide whether they will permanently join or not. So FKTU side is still unclear. But having said that, KCTU side, the more progressive side, as you asked, their agenda is pretty long. Even last week, Tuesday, KCTU, the more progressive side umbrella organization, they staged a demonstration criticizing the government. They were talking about not only the change that's happening in health industry, public sector unions, and also service sector unions, but they were also talking about sinking of Sewol ferry, and they were issuing political attacks against the government. So it's quite clear that KCTU is not politically interested in working with the government at this point. So in that case, it's quite apparent that they're not ready to join this commission. Indeed, they have said this commission, tripartite commission itself, is a vehicle through which the government would like to use the labor side to cooperate for government's agenda. So basically, their KCTU's position is they don't want to be quote-unquote used by the government. So their stance seems to be quite firm.
Well, so what do we see ahead for the future of this tripartite commission? Will it deliver meaningful results down the road?
Well, since KCTU's participation doesn't seem to be very likely at this moment, Tripartite Commission will have to go ahead without KCTU, and FKTU will be probably the only partner in terms of this cooperation. So with that, the government will have to be very realistic about the future prospect here. But the thing is, KCTU is proposing different kind of a body that will replace, current tripartite commission. In that case, there is a hope for the full spectrum of labor participation in this cooperation efforts to advance labor-related agenda here. So I think we need more time to see how things, how things will be worked out in the future.
Well, definitely labor and management relations and the relationship between labor, management, and the government, it's something that needs to be worked out smoothly for this economy to move forward and mature into a bigger economy. So definitely the role of this meeting would be crucial in the future as well. All right, Dr. Kim Myung-kil, thank you so much for today.
Thank you.
And that is your business today on this Wednesday. Thank you for watching. Do join us again at 6 p.m. Korea time on Early Edition at 6.